Hello friends, this time on the new season of Diablo 4, if you want to play a bleeding barbarian, you'll see that you have some great combo with Rend and Charge. I'll explain everything in that video, and big thanks to my mate Lilith who shared this build. I'll start with the skill, and you want to play Bash in order to stun your enemies. It's important to keep in mind this stun effect because you'll apply damage based on bleeding after stunning them. I'll give you more details in the gear part, but first keep this in mind. Then you want to play Rend in order to have also some bleeding, and the Charge in order to have the big damage and also bleeding. For the weapon, you want to have the two-handed bludgeoning weapon on Bash and on Charge, and for the Rend, make sure to have the two-handed sword weapon. You'll also be playing the Cries in order to buff your character. For the Mastery, you want to play the two-handed sword in order to apply bleeding to your enemies. Let's talk about the gear, and first you want to have the fact that you can stun enemies if they are bleeding. You want total armor, damage while berserking, strength and cooldown reduction. For the armor, you want to have increased armor when you hit enemies, and on it you want total armor, damage reduction from bleeding enemies, damage from close enemies, and damage with skills that swap to new weapons, which will be very good with this setup. Then you want to have increased attack speed on the gloves with critical strike chance, ranks of Rend, and attack speed and overpowered damage. For the pants you want to have T-Bolt. It's important because you can be unstoppable using the Charge and using this rallying cry. After that you want to have this aspect, which will extend the duration of berserking, and on it you want movement speed, damage reduction while injured, and berserking duration. For the last stats, you can consider either a resistance or a stats if you want, for example, strength. For the weapon, you'll want to have stats, strength, damage to close enemies, and damage while berserking. And for the first two-handed weapon, the fact that 4 ancients will also charge when you use Charge. You want for the second one to have the fact that when you stun a bleeding enemy, you will apply their total bleeding amount, which can be very interesting. That's why we want to play around stun in this build. Then you want to have increased damage based on your resource, and this one in order to apply bleeding during berserking. For the ring, you'll want the fact that when you swap 8 times your weapon, you will have another power hit, meaning that you want to do 1 bash, 1 rend, 1 bash, 1 red, and so on 8 times, and then cast Charge in order for it to overpower. After that, we want on the ring to have critical strike chance, damage to bleeding enemies, damage while berserking, and damage to close enemies. You also want the new unique ring because it will apply stacks of Rend's bleed when you use the Charge, and also increase Rend's duration, so it will be perfect in this build. Lastly, for the amulet, you want the fact that you'll have increased damage on your Charge when you use several times a core skill, and will be of course very good in this build. For the stats, you want cooldown reduction, damage reduction from close enemies, damage when you swap to a new weapon, and damage while fortified. Finally, if you want, you can also consider the X-File ring, which is interesting because you'll have some damage over time, lucky hit, and so on if you want, instead of an offensive aspect. For the gems, you'll want overpower damage, life, and increased resistances or skulls, and you can also consider, if you prefer, increased damage over time instead of increased overpower damage. For the construct, we'll be playing 2 offensive skills because you want first to have some damage reduction, and the fact that you'll have increased critical strike chance to enemies hit by this spell, and the last one, the fact that enemies will take more bleeding damage if they move, so it will boost a bit your damage over time. Then you want to have turn-based in order to have this stun effect, 15% chance to stun enemies for 2 seconds. You'll also want the fact that it can hit additional enemies, and lastly to grant you some fortification. For the skill tree, you want to play Bash with the fact that you'll be able to overpower with the Rend, which will be quite cool to play with, and increase damage to vulnerable enemies. You also want additional life and damage reduction against allies. The fact that you'll have Fury during the rallying cry, increase life and increase Fury, and grants you some fortify just here. 5 points in Charge, 1 point in cooldown reduction, and 3 points in damage reduction while berserking. You also want 3 points here and 3 points here to have increased damage against stun enemies, and you can also put 1 point here and 1 point here for the remaining points. You want 3 points here in order to have increased bleeding damage to enemies, 3 points here for the critical strike damage, 3 points for the overpowered damage, and 3 points to have a chance to stun enemies. Lastly, we'll play the gushing wands in order to have increased bleeding damage and the fact that you'll create a bleeding explosion when you overpower, and of course will be very good in that build. I'll finish this video with the Paragon setup, and you want to play this glyph which will increase your damage when you swap weapon and also grant you chance to critic. Then you want to have this one which will increase your bleeding damage based on your vulnerable damage bonus. You want to have this glyph, increase damage to close targets, and this one just here, increase damage to bleeding enemies and also reducing your cooldown. You want to take this node which will grant you damage when you make an enemy vulnerable and also when you overpower a vulnerable enemy, and then you want to get here in order to increase your damage while berserking. You want to have this node which will increase your attack speed during berserking, and this glyph just here which will increase your damage to bleeding enemies. Lastly, you have this glyph which is here, it will make enemies vulnerable, so it's very important to have it, and also increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. You'll want to get this node in order to boost your damage while berserking based on your berserking bonus damage. Thanks for watching this video. I hope that you'll enjoy these builds, and of course I wish you a very good time on the new season of Diablo 4.